Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jade Free 906 podcast. Jeff here with you, along with Mike Owen. How you doing, Mike?
Outstanding.
Oh, we have got a fantastic show lined up for you tonight. This is one that, and just take a brief moment to set this up, but this is a gentleman that I had the opportunity to meet and to hear at Phenomicon last year in Vernal, Utah. And Mike kind of put me up to digging into the entire legend of Bigfoot, cryptid world, I guess you could call it, and to look into it. And we started, Mike and I started working and talking about reviewing the shows of the Expedition Bigfoot team, which I found to be very interesting. And we had a lot of fun with that. I don't know what's happening with that show right now, but we haven't heard anything new going there. But listening to the presentations of these folks at Phenomicon was just wonderful. And I learned so very much. And then I had the opportunity to briefly meet our guest tonight. And I'm sure that all the thousands of people that were lined up at his table, he doesn't remember any of that, but that's okay, because I remember speaking with him and getting a chance to hear him, and was very, very impressed. So I think, Mike, you're in the same position with that, are you not?
Yeah, my kids accused me of something called fanboying over Dr. Meldrum. I don't know what that means, but I'm pretty excited about this interview.
Yeah, I am too. And I know that we've got a lot lined up. I will maybe take some questions from you all in the chat tonight, and that's why we like to do these lives. Sometimes Mike and I, we have quite the list of things we want to talk to our guest tonight about. So, but if you do have some questions, please wait until I ask for them, or they will get missed. Linda is helping us moderate tonight. She'll be putting some of those up for us as we go along. So, without further ado, let me please welcome our very special guest. He is a professor with PhD at the Idaho State University of Anthropology and Anatomy. And please welcome author Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Thank you, sir, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm telling you, like I said, getting the opportunity to meet you and listen to you in Vernal was an awesome treat. And I learned so much. And as most of my viewers know, I've always been on the fence with Bigfoot, still am to this day. I'm one of those people who kind of looks for the bones and the body and the solid physical evidence. But I have to tell you, and I think you were kind of along the same lines. Of course, you get much deeper into this, as we'll see tonight. But there's so many credible eyewitness accounts, and there's so much evidence that has been gathered that from credible people, that you just can't throw all that out the window. There has to be something to this. And that's where I've stood for a long time. Is that kind of where you're at with all of this as well?
Well, sure. It's with eyewitness testimony, it's kind of a two-edged sword in a way, because you do have these experiences oftentimes from very credible, very skilled observers, experienced observers, sometimes in very ideal conditions of observation. I mean, there's no two experiences that are exactly on par with one another.
Right.
On the other hand, there's also the opportunity, and with the ever increasing popularity of Sasquatch as a topic and also as an avocational activity, you get people who are very motivated to interpret their experiences, try to in a particular way, try to force it perhaps sometimes into a preconceived mold of an experience, and so there's always been this sort of tug of war. I know one time I was doing a radio interview, and there was a caller, and I'm quite confident it was set up, because the moderator allowed this caller to have at me, so to speak, for a long period of time. And it wasn't problematic. He was bringing up the work of Elizabeth Loftus. Now, for those who don't know, Elizabeth Loftus got some notoriety because of her work in the study of memory and her expert testimony in cases of litigations where especially regressed memory was used to as evidence. And she was arguing that memory was completely reconstructive. It was malleable. It was subject to the influence of even our own recollection, let alone lines of questioning or challenges from outside, or the temptation to embellish. And so she was, was poo-pooing a lot of this. Well, this guy was using that as the basis for his rejection of eyewitness testimony. And you got to just throw them all out. They're unreliable. They're not good data. And I tried to, parry back with various arguments, and I pointed out it's a little different. Take the extreme. You've got this, and no sexism or stereotype intended, but the proverbial little old lady who's been mugged with a lineup of culprits, of potential suspects against the wall, and she's supposed to remember which of these is the correct suspect, and versus an experienced outdoorsman, a hunter or a game warden or something like that, and here in the lineup of their potential candidates of what they may have witnessed is a bear and a deer and an elk and a coyote and a Bigfoot and a hiker. It's kind of apples and oranges to try to compare those two.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
So this caller was exasperated with my offered defenses and so forth and arguments. And his comeback was, if there was an 800-pound gorilla out there in the woods, people would be seeing it. Well, now, wait a minute. That's exactly where we started on this path. And you dismissed offhandedly all eyewitness testimony.
Right.
So you can't have your cake and eat it too. People are seeing it. They are reporting encounters. And so now there's been a really good paper that was just published in a somewhat obscure journal. It's called the Journal of Anomalistics, I think is the proper title. And I can send you a link later. You could.
Okay. That'd be great.
I was involved with reviewing it and writing a commentary for that journal. And but it was an interesting paper because of the history. This individual, White, and I always confuse, and this is terrible because I don't have a lot of patience for people who get Idaho State and University of Idaho confused. But I do the same thing else. I can't remember if it was Arizona State or University of Arizona, but he was a professor of statistics there and had worked with Richard Greenwell, who was then the secretary of the International Society for Cryptozoology. By secretary, that meant he ran the show. He was the managing director. And they had worked on a paper that had tabulated and run statistics on a data set they had accumulated from various sources of eyewitness testimony. And unfortunately, Richard became ill and passed, and the paper never was completed. And so now we were seeing that coming finally to fruition. So I was excited to see that. Plus, he had done a lot of literature review of this very question of the credibility, reliability of eyewitness testimony. And the pendulum, since Elizabeth Loftus's heyday, has swung the other direction.
Really?
And there's one person in particular, and I'm off the cuff here, so I can't think of his name, but a researcher in particular at the forefront of trying to counter that. I mean, his argument basically is, hey, under appropriate conditions, our powers of observation and our ability to recall detail is really remarkably good. We've had a long history of evolutionary, natural selection that has sharpened that skill because it's a survival skill,
right?
In a hunter-gatherer setting or in any setting. I mean, even if you translate it to modern setting, just with different circumstances. And so he prefaces their analysis with that perspective, that renewed sense of reliability of eyewitness testimony. And it's a really interesting paper, an outcome of remarkably, as we were talking in the prelude there, the remarkable consistency of so many sometimes rather innocuous details that really point to people truly experiencing something that is real, that it has occurred and represents a real entity. So it's always, I mean, now, if you want to play devil's advocate, you can find lots and lots and lots of examples of misidentification.
That's what I was going to ask you about. Yeah, absolutely.
And I spend a lot of my day, well, not a lot of my day, but a lot of my effort actually is eaten up by sifting through stuff that is submitted to me on a regular basis. And I appreciate that very much. I appreciate the sharing the data with me, because out of those dozens and dozens of submissions, there will be a gem. There will be a kernel of real good hard evidence that, an exceptional set of footprints, for example. And so it's worth the time. And I try to use those interactions as opportunities also to educate the investigators. These citizen science is what we're striving for.
There you go. I like that.
Elevate their skill set, elevate their powers of discrimination and interpretation and so on. So it's worthwhile. And then sometimes I'll actually take some of those examples and post them on my Facebook page, or I'm actually accumulating a number of I'm working, one of my little side book projects is kind of a forensic handbook looking at footprints and illustrating through numerous case studies the distinguishing characteristics of the Sasquatch foot as expressed in the footprint, and how it can be differentiated from bears, for example, or from humans, which are the most common misidentifications. But even some other forms of wildlife, when you get, registered tracks of a bounding quadruped through snow, it's so tempting. You see that kind of slightly alternating pattern, or this walk on a tightrope, which is so overly exaggerated in its attribution to Sasquatch trackways. Many times it's just simply a bounding animal that leaves a straight line that looks like a series of right and left footprints of something walking in a straight line, but it's tightrope walking. But it's really, if all they have to do is they walk up and point the camera down and take a picture of the interior of one of those punch marks, they would almost certainly see the individual paw prints of the four appendages. Right. But that would spoil the fun of the discovery, and so it's always a red flag when someone neglects to make that effort. So.
Yeah, exactly. I can imagine. Let's go back a little bit and to the kind of the beginnings, if you will, of how, obviously you're a professor of anatomy and anthropology. So where did you find you got an interest in looking into the Sasquatch phenomenon? Where did that come from, if you don't mind my asking that?
Sure. No, yeah. That's a common question, and it's hard to pinpoint unless you go right back to the very beginning. So the first time I ever heard of Bigfoot, I was about 11 years old in fifth grade in Spokane, Washington. And it just so happened that was one of the first towns, if not the first, and I haven't quite satisfied if it was indeed the inaugural showing of the Patterson-Gimlin film, his documentary that showcased the actual film footage from Bluff Creek. And I became aware of the advertisement for that through kids at school talking about it, ran home that day and opened the paper, and sure enough, there was the advertisement to be shown in the Spokane Coliseum. Convinced my dad that we had to go see this, and he took me and my younger brother Mike to this showing, and that was the start. And it was a big kind of supernova of curiosity and interest, it embodied so many things that I was already. I mean, it's not like it came completely out of the blue, because I was, convinced that my life revolved around zoology, particularly, and collecting insects and animals, and little natural history museum in the bedroom, and terraria, and all kinds of things, and so on.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated too with prehistory, with dinosaurs, as so many kids go through that dinosaur phase.
Yep.
But it went, I could, other kids could name baseball players and their stats. I could name all of the dinosaurs that characterized each of the epochs and their statistics. That kind of distraction. So that interest then over the years waxed and waned, obviously, but it was always there. It always kind of steeled or focused in some ways my intrigue with human evolution and primatology more broadly. And anatomy sort of came into the picture. Well, I mean, it formally came. I mean, obviously it formed the basis of a lot of the things that were so fascinating to me, and the reason I took to it so readily. But it became something of a means to an end in a way. It was at the time that I was contemplating now going to grad school, when I finally discovered. It's so funny how things happen. Just, I mean, there were a series of little events where I was at a fork in the road where I did or did not go to college.
Oh.
Whether I pursued developing a career in carpentry, which is what I had done all through, as summer jobs in various, from framing to cabinetry to finish work, and loved working with my hands, loved doing that, and saw that as a means making a living, but was also offered a scholarship on a lark. I went down and did the interviews for college, and was offered essentially a half-ride scholarship. I got 2.5 years free of college. My parents said, go do it. Just if you don't like it, then when you but you've got this offer, this free money, go take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And boy, I mean, then I just was introduced in a different way to the world of academia, which has lost some of its luster over the years. But at that time, I mean, that was, for me, that was the collegiate experience. And man, and I looked at my professors and I go, how do you get to become a professor? And so at that time, although anthropology did embody so much of what I was fascinated with, I mean, there's also zoology, but I really liked the human element. There was a glut of students and a dearth of positions, of jobs in academia, and I didn't really want to do, archaeology was interesting, but I didn't want to be a contract archaeologist for the highway department or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
So it turns out that a new discipline, a new pathway was opening up, literally right before me. I mean, it was like the sea. I was like Moses, and the sea was parting in front of me, because the anatomy departments were discovering that they had fewer and fewer faculty who were willing or interested in teaching human gross anatomy, the full body dissection, because they were becoming, so much of the research was subcellular and molecular. And so they were thinking, how are we going to get these courses taught? Well, they realized that there were anthropologists with training in physical anthropology, which incorporated a lot of anatomy, a lot of functional morphology and comparative anatomy and so forth. And they were quite qualified, quite skilled at teaching human gross anatomy, with just a little more experience in the clinical side of it, the applied side of it. And so these programs were popping up all across the country, these hybrid programs where faculty with anthro degrees were being employed in anatomy departments, and of course then they would attract graduate students, and so new programs of training were developing a different kind of degree. So my degree was not in anthropology; it was in anatomical sciences with an emphasis in physical anthropology. So I didn't have the classic, 4 disciplines of archaeology, linguistics, and sociology and physical. It was just the physical side of it. But that really was much more to my liking.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like I said, had I been looking at graduate programs just 4 years earlier, these opportunities wouldn't have been available, wouldn't have been realized. So anyway, and so that's how, from that perspective, my research interest focused on the evolution of, as you said, of human walking, human bipedalism, and some of that was certainly influenced by my fascination by the fossil, or the footprint record, the footprint data, as it bore on Sasquatch. Although it wasn't overtly the driving force. I mean, there was that underlying undercurrent that certainly influenced it. And I kind of kept up over the years with some of the things like Dr. Krantz's book. I can remember purchasing that and reading it and being very intrigued by his interpretation of the foot form and function.
Right.
And, and so that just kind of bolstered. I mean, the real reason that the locomotor anatomy, I think the real catalyst was while I was an undergraduate, I was in as an undergraduate from, let's see, it would have been 79. So 79 through, I did 3 years, 82. And it was so right on the heels of kind of what some have labeled as the golden era of paleoanthropology, the discovery of Lucy and all the breakthroughs in human fossil record of East Africa. And there was a paper that came out from SUNY Stony Brook where there was quite a cohort of professors who were these recruited anthropologists. And this was one of those programs where that approach was being pursued. Anyway, who wrote this quite substantial paper that appeared in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology on the locomotor anatomy of Australopithecus afarensis. And it was a treatment, an exhaustive analysis from top to bottom of the skeletal anatomy of this hominin, and with particular attention to those adaptations for bipedalism. And that just captivated me. That's what I wanted to do. And so they dovetailed quite nicely. So my training ultimately put me in a position where, when in 1996, I was taken out and shown these fresh footprints in the ground. I had studied all kinds of footprints. I had done experiments with chimps walking through track boxes and documenting their footprints as they walked in various ways. I had studied the Laetoli hominin footprints, and gone to Berkeley and visited with Tim White and looked at his stereo photographs, looked at things that few other people had ever witnessed, because they'd never been made public or made in their full extent.
Right.
So I was rather uniquely qualified. There are quite a few academicians out there now who do similar sorts of things, but at the time that I was embarking, there were few people who were particularly focused on the lower extremity in the foot in a very specialized way. And I was part of literally a first generation of students who were drawn into those questions at that time. Now we've seen several successive generations, and there's probably several dozen scholars out there Not all of whom are impressed by or cite my work because I'm the Bigfoot guy.
Yeah.
What good could come from, it's like, what good could come from Bethlehem? It's what good could come from Meldrum. And so they're a bit incestuous in their citations, which is always a bit annoying. But when you see, especially when you see things that you said 20 years ago repeated and cited by someone who probably read it in one of your papers but never bothered to cite it, that's always. But at this point, it's like, it's like I said, there's a little tarnish that I have to mentally polish
Yeah,
up.
I can imagine. Yeah, for sure.
Turning into that crotchety old professor.
Well, it makes you uniquely qualified, though.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at your history, and that's why I asked that question, because I wanted to see where your background brought you into all this, and it does. It makes you uniquely qualified to be able to discern what you're seeing in prints and castings and things like that. So, I know you've written a book too. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to add one other thing. It's kind of interesting how that has worked too, because when you look at Dr. Krantz's, who is my predecessor, he was a physical anthropologist, and he was a pretty darn good anatomist as well. I mean, his research wasn't focused in that, but and I'm not sure if he taught human gross anatomy. He probably taught at least human osteology, but it was the footprints that was the compelling argument for him, especially the Bosberg Cripplefoot, which maybe we can talk about later, which is a really remarkable case. But also, the first book that was written by a PhD, Bigfoot, and then I can't remember the subtitle, The Sasquatch and Yeti and Myth and Reality, I think it was, by Dr. John Napier, who was a British primatologist and head of the primatology program, if there really was one, at the Smithsonian. And he was an anatomist and an MD, physician. So he had that anatomical basis of a medical education as well, that and had written extensively on particularly the hands, but also the feet, and was an expert in primate locomotion. He was really the father of our current, laid the foundation of our current thoughts, thinking about primate categories of primate locomotion and understanding their evolutionary diversification. So it's really quite interesting that those academics that have been the most involved and have been the most impressed with and have made the effort to evaluate the evidence, especially the footprint evidence. I mean, that was Napier concluded, for all his negative aspects, and his book's not perfect, and he was limited by the limited sample size that he had to work with, the limited data, and by some antiquated ideas in anthropology that he was still laboring under. But he still concluded, he said, something's leaving those footprints. And so he said, there's got to be something to this. Whether it's all it's cracked up to be, that remains to be seen. But something is leaving these footprints and needs to be explained. So I think that's kind of an interesting perspective too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I wanted to mention too that you've written a book, and I mentioned author at the beginning, and I am currently just about finished with it. I'm right to the last chapter, and it's the Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. And I love the approach that you have taken on this book.
Got my book right here.
Yep, I have the audio book version, and I found out tonight after speaking with you earlier that I've got to get the hard copy because you've got illustrations in there that I've heard you mention.
There's a lot more data. There's charts. I love my charts.
Yeah, so I've got to jump over it and get that. But that's perfect, because this is exactly the side that I'm on with all of this. I try to stay away from the emotional side of the Bigfoot sightings and such things, even though I do there are a lot of credible people that have come across, and some have shared their experiences with me.
Sure.
And I'm left going, wow, this does not sound like a misidentification or somebody who's just trying to make up a story. It sounds legitimate to me.
Right.
And you see the emotion, that they tell. But you are adding that science side to this and bringing the two together. And as you go through the book, I find it very fascinating that you really dig deeply into these things. It's not just a cursory, you take different stories and different accounts, I'll call them, and you break them down
Yeah.
and you dig right into them. And that's what I find so fascinating about that. And I'm going to suggest to anybody, if you're interested in this, check out his book. It's Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. Very, very good book. And that was written quite a few years ago, wasn't it?
It was, and yeah, and well, in fact, I'm working on the sequel.
That's where I was going next.
Perfect.
But in the process of considering what to include in the sequel, how to approach the sequel, it has given me an opportunity to review it. I mean, I really, I'm no brag or anything, or no self adulation, but I really poured myself into that effort because I knew that it was going to be a controversial title. And I mean, just to show you how controversial, the publisher sent out review copies to a list of potential reviewers, which I had also provided at least a couple of dozen journals and news magazines and so forth, science magazines, that I thought would be appropriate to consider this for a review. Of those 200 copies that were sent out, I have been able to find, I think, maybe 2 reviews.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
I mean, it's like they didn't know what to do with it.
Wow.
They didn't know what to do with it. And so it wouldn't get, and yet some of these, you can see on my shelf back there are titles that are really embarrassing products from some of my colleagues, some who've taken a very skeptical position, and they are praised and shouted from the rooftops and get review upon review upon review. And it's just amazing to me. I mean, it's just a real commentary on the politics and the foibles of human nature, I guess. But my point is that I really put a lot of effort into that, and I think it shows. And it is while it's dated, and in the sense that it only covers material up to a point, there is nothing in there that I would go back and revise by way of correction. I think it stands, and it still is a good introduction. It's accessible. I tried to make it, this was intended not as an academic, well, I should say, not as a scholarly published academic book, but rather as a popular book with a lot of meat on the bones.
Yep, absolutely. I agree.
When it comes to the chapter on footprints, I pulled stops. And there's for some people that's tough sledding, but there are lots of pictures. That's the point.
Yeah.
There are lots of illustrations that depict and diagram and present some of the things that are talked about there, so that it should come through. What's interesting is, there was a spike of sales, as you would expect, and then it started to taper off. And what we're seeing now is it's picking up again, which I'm only point out because it's a barometer of the next generation of enthusiasts that are coming up chronologically, and or being reached by various other forms of information flow, and they're being it's always interesting, I think, when you go to one of these conferences, and particularly the ones that are focused on this topic and haven't cast the net more broadly to other paranormal phenomenon. But whether it's me or some speaker will ask, usually it's the organizer, they'll ask, for how many of you is this the first conference you've ever attended? And half the audience will raise their hand. There's a lot of newbies, if you will, new novices to the topic.
Yep.
And as a result, there's a lot of interest again in the book, which I still think, even though it was published some time ago, 2006 was it, that still is a very worthwhile read.
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100%.
I mean, I pick it up and get pulled in and start reading it, but yeah, so I am working on the sequel, as you may know.
Excellent.
Good.
Doug Hychek, who produced. Oh, and other people also, people should know, because there's sometimes some confusion. This was initiated as a companion volume to the documentary produced by Doug Hychek of White Wolf Entertainment of the same title. And it started off, I had actually suggested to him, because I worked closely with Doug on some aspects of the development of the project, and he was always telling me about the very interesting interviews he was having with these different scientists. I mean, because it wasn't just me representing Legend Meets Science, not Legend meeting Dr. Meldrum, but lots of other professors and professionals who were introduced to the topic or who addressed the topic. Some introduced for the very first time, no prior experience with or real interest really in the subject per se, but when presented with the opportunity to evaluate a piece of evidence in their field of discipline, were more than willing to and eager to do that. So I'm thinking there's all this material that's probably on the cutting room floor. And wow, what a companion volume. And I suggested, are you going to have someone write a companion? Oh no, we'll just stick some of the extras in the bonus features of the DVD. And I go, oh, that's right, we're in the digital age, aren't we? So that's, yeah, all right. Well then later, his next door neighbor, who was kind of a jack of all trades in many ways, made the same remark and said, "Oh, you should do a companion volume." And the guy, and so Doug said to the guy, it was Michael Chu was his name. Michael, why don't you do that? Why don't you take that project on? And you might ask Dr. Meldrum. He might like to write it for you.
There you go.
And that's where it came. Well, as we got writing, it turns out, and this is kind of a funny little footnote, little trivial detail, but Doug shot the thing in 35 millimeter film, which is quite expensive film, but very high quality, product,
right?
Result. But he was frugal, and so he would set up his shots and set up his interviews very, very meticulously, and actually have a lot of pre-interview conversations and not rehearsals or scripting, but the interviews were shot in essentially one take. There wasn't a lot edited out.
Oh wow!
When I asked for all, I asked for, video copies of all of his film, and I got them, and there wasn't very much. I go, this is going to be a pamphlet, and so I said, I've been doing this now I've been involved with this for 10 years, and I've accumulated so much experience in entertainment. I would have eventually written a book of my own. Why don't we wed those efforts, and I'll, let me blow the barn doors open. And so we did. And so in each chapter, it follows more or less the format of the documentary, but each chapter will have fourfold, fivefold the detail and examples and so instead of just the content of a 50-minute documentary. So people sometimes think, oh well, I'll get the DVD. Two different things completely. I mean, they complement one another,
right?
But there's lots more material. So that pamphlet, grew into a well-illustrated, substantial, but still accessible. It's not War and Peace or anything like that. Yeah. It's very, very manageable. So he's underway with the sequel, and basically wants to just build upon the momentum that was developed in the first effort, and especially, emphasizing what has developed with each of these arenas of evidence in the past 20 years plus. And, what do experts have to say today? And especially emphasize, he's very into various technologies.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can we apply these different technologies to the analysis of the evidence, whether it's hair or whether it's DNA or whether it's bioacoustics, So the work of David Ellis, who's done just tremendous things with extending our understanding of vocalizations, that will be featured prominently in the documentary and in the book. So it's been fun. It's been fun to pull all these things together. In some ways, it's going to be a challenge to keep the focus narrow. I mean, my other project that keeps getting pushed, the can kicked down the path is a book which will cast the net more broadly to look at the notion of relic hominoids around the world. We've seen a paradigm shift from what was called the single species hypothesis, where human evolution was this unilinear single file march. And if that model were accurate, then there can be only one bipedal hominin species in the niche at any time. And so that's why, you get scientists say they can't exist, therefore they don't exist. And it doesn't matter the evidence you think you have, because in their minds, there's no place to put another bipedal hominin. Well, now we know, in fact, it was a bushy tree with lots of parallel branches. It is possible to partition the hominin niche. And there are different ways to be a bipedal hominin. And we have evidence of species persisting, lineages persisting alongside us until the very recent past. That Homo naledi has gotten a lot of attention of late for its very recent, this thing that has the brain the size of a chimpanzee, but stands upright bipedally, very bipedal.
So I have a specific question about Homo naledi. So yes. Jeff, I sent you a couple of pictures about that.
Yep.
If you get the first one pulled up that has, that. Yeah. So Jeremy Da Silva was at the top there. Zoom back out just a little bit, Jeff, because I want to give credit there to Jeremy Da Silva. Yeah. This is a YouTube presentation that he did, and what it came from was they have collected enough bones to basically construct the skeleton digitally.
Right.
And what he said as they were about to present this, and this was an animation, I just have a screen grab for illustration purposes. But what he said specifically was, as they were looking at the skeleton, the heels are quite odd. Their ankle is unusual. The knees looks like ours, but is different in some peculiar ways. The hip joint looks like ours too, but not quite. There's these fascinating differences. And he worked with a team of PTs, physical therapists, to try and come up with how it walked bipedally, because we know that it did. And he had a student that was interested in gaming, and the student basically created this digitally and animated it and had it walk. And as they were showing it walk, this was right as it was kind of, the camera was circling around it. It was dead front center, and they were commenting on how the knees knock inward. And then, Jeff, if you go to the second picture of it, I drew some lines, because as I got to looking at it, I began to wonder, well, they're assuming that it's walking like a human with straddle between the left and right foot, right? So, that's just the way it was animated, and that would knock the knee in towards the center. But what if the foot was actually more center lined, where you can see I drew a line over the lower leg and the upper leg, the femur in blue, and then I've got a red line that brings the shin bone vertical. If you then put the left and right foot that close to the center line and there isn't much of a straddle, then that's a lot closer to what we sometimes see with Bigfoot. Is that, this is one of those cases where, in my mind, I don't see them reaching out to you to say, hey, what do you know about Bigfoot? And should we consider anything with, which is tragic, right? Because they're not considering all the information that's out there. Is this something that could be determined? Where were they placing the foot? How do we know that it was off to the side? Could it have been more centered? I'm, like I said, my background's in mechanical engineering. If this was made out of metal or wood, I could probably tell you, but bones, I'm out of my wheelhouse.
Well, a couple things. First of all, let me extend perhaps a caveat that there's very little we know about the details of the anatomy of the Sasquatch skeleton, other than what we can, I think, confidently infer from the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Mm-hmm.
That's, a sample of one. And you know how idiosyncratic human walking is.
Yep. And
you just have to sit in an airport like I've done and watch people the way they walk. And there's just lots and lots of impacts of weight and of fitness and so forth, and just variation in shape. So having said that, and also emphasize to you and to the listeners, and we kind of alluded to it in our little pre-conversation, that the whole notion of the walking in the tightrope walk,
Yep.
as attributed to Sasquatch, is just overstated. And I can't emphasize how that enough. I think there opportunities to assess the gait pattern of a Sasquatch from a long trackway of footprints. That those are rare and far between. And I missed a real opportunity, quite honestly. I've got one photograph from that experience where I witnessed footprints in '96 that allows us to look at the pattern of gait a little bit. And the only real interesting thing that comes out is when they look over their shoulder, they turn their body slightly, and their foot on that side angles out 45 degrees from the line of progression. This, at least in this individual. And I've seen other examples. John Green has a great shot in one of his books. I think it's The Year of the Sasquatch, where it's on a shot on a beach in Washington or British Columbia, but a long line of tracks, and about every third or fourth footprint is angled out 45 degrees. And he muses over, well, why could that be? Was it an injury? Was it something? No, I think it was just as simple as the thing was looking over its shoulder. Every now and again, it's out in the open and it's checking on the backside. It has its situational awareness. And when you look over your shoulder, your foot's going to angle out if you twist far enough. But anyway, So having said that, then backing up. So
to eliminate all mosquitoes in a 400 square feet radius.
I'm sorry.
This simple but brilliant trick.
My apology on that. Sorry.
That's all right. Is that the YouTube video? De Silva's description, that you read or paraphrased, is so typical for popular science. It differs in peculiar ways, but he doesn't give you any.
No, nothing to go on.
And you have to dig back to the original, and even there, sometimes you don't get it. You end up with this paragraph that's used so many times. More analysis is necessary, which is simply code for I'm submitting a grant renewal next month.
Stay tuned.
Yeah. Anyway, it's perfectly natural for the knees, if you're going to if he's referring to knock-kneed as simply that the knees are brought in under the center of mass, as opposed to a chimp when it stands upright and the legs come essentially straight down to the ground. That's perfectly natural, and that's characteristic of all hominin bipeds. That's a hallmark of that transition to habitual bipedalism, as opposed to the facultative, the opportunistic upright stance and tottering gait of a chimpanzee or gorilla in bipedal walking. And so what's called the valgus angle of the femur is what affords that inward positioning of the foot, so that as we're walking bipedally, it is placed, even though we have variable amount of straddle, and it depends on just individual, idiosyncrasies. It depends on the state of inebriation. It depends on a lot of things, on how, the age, how wide that straddle is, or how angled the toes are. There's a huge amount of variation. Anyway, but the mechanical constraint is that when we walk on 2 legs as opposed to 4, there are periods of time when one of our supporting appendages is not offering any support. It's swinging. And so our mass is now poised over a single point of support.
Right.
Which, if it's offset at all, well, and whether it's offset or not, the pelvis is offset. So the hips are offset from the line of the center of mass below the center of gravity. And so each time you lift, well, you can see it in this figure. In fact, they've incorporated a little bit. There's a little bit of list or pelvic tilt. Actually, it's a better way.
Yep.
List usually means the side-to-side movement, but that occurs as well. So you have, since there's a tendency for tilt, there needs to be muscles that counteract that tendency for tilt. Plus, you can reduce the torque on that supporting hip by listing, that is, by shifting the weight so that it's more directly over the center of mass. And so when we walk, there's a slight tendency for our center of mass to kind of go like this as we shift from one support limb to another. Now, as you increase speed, there's a tendency to place the feet even more squarely under the center of mass. You break into a sprint, and your feet are landing right smack under the center of mass. So you don't have those jolting forces that have to be absorbed by or resisted by the abductors, namely the gluteus medius. And that's dictated the rearrangement of the pelvis so that the pelvic blades don't face front to back only, which only allows then the glutes to be retractors of the hip. But if you then shorten those down and wrap them around, so more bowl-like, now this side surface provides attachment for a muscle which has been brought around to the side. So now it's an abductor. It's over the lateral side of the hip rather than behind the hip. So those muscles, and you see this, I mean, sometimes the most dramatic demonstration is in the pathology. So if someone suffers a paralysis of the gluteal muscles, they have a very distinctive walk, and that's called the Trendelenburg sign. And I won't try to demonstrate it here in front of the camera, but it involves, a flailing of the arms and a leaning of the body to get the center of mass, like a tightrope walker would, trying to reach over the tightrope. Or a chimpanzee that has a wide straddle does, because they don't have any muscles to do it around the hip. Well, they have muscles, but not in the right place in the hip. So what they look like a tightrope walker, throwing their arms from side to side. If you see an actor exaggerating an attempt to imitate a chimpanzee, that's what they're doing. They're throwing their arms back and forth. They don't know why they're doing it, but that's why the chimpanzee does it. So Naladi, or Naladi, I never know how to pronounce that. I always get the vowels flipped around. But as far as at least from the presentation there, I'll have to look up that YouTube video. I have not seen it myself. There's nothing. There are certainly subtle differences in the way, but the problem is in the way some of these hominins walked. But the problem with being too assertive in those kind of inferences is that we're working with a real small sample size. And as I pointed out earlier, it doesn't take long to appreciate the tremendous diversity in the way humans walk with a human anatomy. And I don't think we would ever equate. I mean, there are differences, subtle differences in skeletal conformation at the ankle and at the knee and hips in individuals that demonstrate markedly different gaits. I mean, you can see it extremes today as an unfortunate result of the tendency for obesity. There is a tendency for the arches of the feet to collapse into pronation, which causes the knees, the ankle, to roll inward, which drives the tibia, the shin bone, inward. And these people have these terribly knock-kneed posture and gait because of that excessive weight and the dysfunctional posture of the foot skeleton. So there have been a few papers here and there. Dan Gibo wrote a paper a couple decades ago where he talked about the wobbly walk of these particular Australopithecines. He was another foot guy of my generation, and but you know, it's nothing. I would pause there for a moment because in his analysis, Doug, or his own personal viewing of the Patterson-Gimlin film, Doug Hychek, and this comes out in the book, talks about this, what he calls a walleye, where Patty seems to walk with a particularly curious sort of swing to her knee.
Mm-hmm.
And it also causes, and this is evident in the parting shots in the Patterson-Gimlin film, where you see this little figure, you know, disappearing into the distance. And as she lifts her feet and swings forward, her feet turn outward. And what this reminds me of, but in a more exaggerated expression of it, if you've ever watched or yourself experienced donning your swim fins on the beach,
Yep.
and then trying to walk into the surf, you have this high lifting gait, and you tend to kind of turn the tips of your swim fins out as you swing them around so you avoid catching your toes. You know, we walk with an extremely conservative gait, where our swing limb barely is lifted up. And it doesn't need too much clearance because we pole vault over an essentially extended support limb.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is so minimal clearance that if you're walking down the sidewalk and there's a square that's a quarter of an inch out of sync, thunk, you catch your toe and down you go, you know. Well, imagine Patty with feet that, because of that tremendously elongated heel and relatively long toes, although there is some foreshortening of the midfoot, the metatarsals, her foot to leg ratio, again, sample of one, bear in mind, we're drawing inferences from her, that she's representing her species. Foot to leg ratio is a little higher than in human. Her lower limb to torso ratio is a bit lower than in humans, you know, and her resulting with these long, massive, muscled forelimbs, her intermembral index is outside of the range of variation for humans. It's up in the high 90s, whereas humans on average are about in the mid 70s, and only extremes would be in, you know, the upper 70s, maybe low 80s. But there's no overlap. She's outside of human variation. So, you know, again, this is important because if you're going to argue that she's a human in a costume, you got to have some weird, or not weird, but some extra accommodations,
right,
for to make the arms exceptionally long by comparison. But she walks, I think, is as a behavioral adaptation to her massive weight, 700 plus pounds. She walks with a compliant gait, with flexed knees and hips and ankles. So her support limb isn't providing as much clearance for the swing foot as a human would with a fully extended limb instead of a compliant limb.
Uh-huh.
So she's got to lift that foot even higher. So you may have heard of this carrying angle of the, in this case, it's referring, and that's a term we do use in anatomy for the upper arm, different story. But here we're talking about the angle between the femur and the tibia, the thigh and the shin, essentially the way the knee, and how the foot is carried forward. And it's very high, much more so. I mean, I was really impressed when I saw, I can't remember who was the first to really break it down, but they had examples. Even women walking in high heels still have an angle, a carrying angle that's almost the same as someone walking barefoot. I mean, it's just the way we walk. Whereas Patty is way outside that, much higher lift. An interesting little anecdote. I used to teach in the anthro department a survey of living primates until they had some change up in the faculty, and one of the instructors got his PhD, and he sucked up all of my overload teaching opportunities down there. But I used to show the Patterson-Gimlin film, and would have the students evaluate this, and was pointing out the various adaptations after we had talked about bipedalism and so forth, and its role in hominin evolution, and yada yada yada. Well, anyway. One of the students was actually from Australia, had been a licensed practicing physical therapist in Australia, was back, midlife change of careers, and had gone back to school and was interested in studying anthropology and archaeology. And she sat there just puzzling over this. Well, I was walking back across campus because we were anthro and biology on opposite sides of campus. She comes chasing me down. Dr. Meldrum, I just had to share this with you. She said, I was just fretting over this. Something looked familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She said, then I realized when I would treat, and she would, do gait analysis and evaluations and treatments of patients. She said, when I would treat some Aboriginal patients that grew up in the outback, I mean, and never wore shoes and for much of their life, and rarely were on flat surfaces. When they would walk across my examination floor, they would lift their feet so high, like they were walking through the bush. And she said, so Patty used to very broken, uneven terrain, not a flat sandbar, unobstructed because of the scouring effect of the seasonal flooding that wiped that sandbar essentially clean of all brush and alders. She said it still walked as if it was walking through the off trail through the forest. She goes, when I realized that, she says, that's got to be a real film, a real creature.
So that's one of the things I've noticed is, and you bring up some of this in the book but I've seen news articles. I think the Wall Street Journal was talking about how there's a lot of closet Bigfoot fans in the scientific community, and one in particular that they interviewed and quoted, of course, remained anonymous. Worked with primates in a zoo, and she had been out walking in the woods and came across a nest. And as she was staring at it, realized it was identical to the exact kind of nest she watched the primates, the large silverbacks, make for themselves out of boughs. And she's like, there has to be something to this, which is, again, I appreciate your book and the amount of data in the book, being a science guy and engineer, that the data is credible. I don't know what the conclusion is, but the data is credible and it's massive. There is a mountain of data that once you start down this rabbit hole, it's you really get sucked in, and you're like, boy, it's really getting hard, even though there's not quote unquote proof, or a body, or, we don't have standards for male and female, that kind of thing. But boy, we got just about everything else. You mentioned weight, and you brought up Patty and 700 pounds. I've seen Jeff Glickman in the 90s, I think, North American Science Institute did an evaluation. Didn't really know anything about Bigfoot or anything. Came up with a weight of 1,400 pounds. What it seems like we're all over the map when it comes to weight, and even with the Patty, they were trying to make impressions. Patterson and Gimmel were trying to make impressions in the sand next to her imprints, and she sunk in like an inch, and they could barely make a dent. And I know since then they talked about spreading the logging companies spread quicklime on the sand, I guess, to try and firm it up. Not it doesn't turn it into concrete or anything, but it allowed the logging trucks to get across the road there better. And so it wasn't like it was super soft, like people would think a beach would be, and that it would be easy to get an inch. But are we using the right? It seems like people try to put human muscle density on Patty, and are like, well, she's probably 300 pounds. It couldn't be that big, but she's very thick. Arms, bones, everything. Stout. Are we using the right models? How do we know what the density is? Are other primates muscle? Does it weigh more, per square inch, or is it? I know they're stronger, but
that's correct. Okay, so roll back to Glickman.
Yep.
Glickman and there was some interaction with Henner Fehrenbach, I think, on this point, and it's been a while, so the details are a little, but they used a regression based on a small range of primates, and with this regression line, the confidence limits at the ends of the regression, flare out like this. And that's just typical of that kind of a model. And so they're extending beyond, and I don't even remember if the regression had, I think that was one of the real criticisms. Didn't even have large bodied apes in it. It just had monkeys and prosimians. And so it gave this, really low confidence. I didn't have confidence in it and criticized it heavily at the time. What I did, and you're right, and then there've been other attempts like Bob jumping off the stump, trying to see how far his cowboy boots would sink in, and walking the horse across the sand and so forth. And I'd point out too, I've got a little film canister. People don't know what that is anymore either. That is so bad you can't get film canisters anymore. They were so handy to store all kinds of things.
Oh yeah,
saved them. But anyway, of the sand from that sandbar. Now, granted, it was 30 years later, 67, 97. Yeah, it would have been 97. But I actually had it professionally described. The sand, the quality and characteristics of the sand described and quantified by a physical geologist, and included that description in the paper I published on the ichnotaxonomy of the Sasquatch footprints, because we used as the type and the referred specimens Rogers right and left, and the 10 that Bob Titmus cast. And so I included in the discussion, or in the description, along with the description of the substrate. And it was a very angular, grained, eroded shale, not a quartz sand. So even dry, when impressed, it would hold its shape remarkably well. But, okay, so back to my approach. The only reasonable approach, you can do compression tests, and as an engineer, you know how the conditions of the substrate can vary so much, just from hour to hour. depending on moisture content and other variables and so forth. And so it's one thing to do compression tests for engineering projects. It's another if you're trying to differentiate between two creatures who recently walked across a sandbar. So while you can get kind of very relative sense by comparing those, coming up with an absolute value is, I think, unrealistic. So what we did is I took the measurements that were derived very meticulously by John Green from careful tracings of projections of Patty from still frames of the film, and he allowed for hair. Her hair doesn't seem to be extremely long. Mm-hmm. It's a fairly tight coat of hair, which seems to probably be a female characteristic of the species, I think, in my own opinion. But allowing for that, he came up with dimensions. And even if he's 5% off in each of those linear dimensions because of hair, not a huge deal. Yep. But as you said, her girth, her body mass is just. I have one slide where I have a picture of Laquan Jones. Is it? I can't think. He's the biggest NFL football player right now, and I have a picture of him in this running posh pose in his outfit, in his uniform. But right next to Patty in her full swing, it makes a stunning. And when you scale them, and I put Patty right between 6.5 and 7 feet in height. Mm-hmm. So John had put her, based on his interpretation, using the foot as a scale at 6'8". So that's right in there. So mm-hmm. It's good for a ballpark. I think estimates of way in excess of 7 foot are wrong, as I think any estimates down at 6 foot level or below are wrong, demonstrably wrong. Yeah. And but in any case, using the dimensions, and he's got a side view and a front view. I modeled her body as essentially a series of cylinders, just to get a ballpark. So I wasn't going, trying to taper. I was just estimating, sure. rough ideas. Mm-hmm. But especially, as you say, she's as deep front to back as she is side to side, and she's amazingly wide side to side.
Yep.
And anyway, using that, and then I did just simply rely on approximate densities of composite tissue that are used in, human anthropometrics and so forth. Now, while acknowledging that she could have a much more robust skeleton, so the skeleton to muscle ratio might be a little different, although I don't think so much, because I think, as you look at the human gracilization of the skeleton, the muscular system has similarly greatly reduced in volume as well. And there shouldn't be any difference in density between muscle mass in apes and humans. It's been said chimps, for example, are 5 times as strong as a human.
Right.
And if were that true, it was attributed to just differences in muscle physiology, that they might have more cross bridges or able to recruit more motor units consistently. There was actually an attempt to quantify that. It was a group at Stony Brook. I think might have been another colleges or university as well, but one of my, at the time she was a visiting assistant professor, Dr. Larson, kind of headed up. And they tried to do some actual measurements of what the apes were capable. And it's always hard. I mean, you can't really ask the chimp, are you squeezing as hard as you possibly can? But they had various activities and things that would try to gauge that. And they said that they felt that the 5 factor was overrated, that chimps probably were in the range of 1.5 to 3 times. I mean, still, it's, chimp can hang its whole body weight from the tip of its. I've watched one do it on a windowsill from a 2nd-story window overlooking an enclosure, and there was a ruckus going on, and one of them ended up up against our window, and then he dropped down, and he was literally hanging by the fingertip of one finger.
That's crazy.
Anyway,
yeah.
that process was what yielded for me the 700 plus. It came out about 736 pounds. But again, even with a 10% plus or minus, that it still brackets that range. 600 to 800 pounds. I'm fine with anything in there. Laquan was only 400. Let's see, was he just under 400 pounds? I think, and he's 6'7".
Right.
6'7".
Yeah, I was just saying, how many humans do you know that are over 6 foot that weigh above 500 pounds? I mean, so that then leads me, of course, then to the next obvious question is, when you are carrying that much weight, you walk differently, especially when you're trying to move quickly. We were on Patty, so she was trying to move away. Now, granted, I know there's reports that they can move much, much faster than that, but she was walking away. They don't walk like you said earlier, like we walk on stilts, basically on stiff legs. And so all of this to me, this is again, why it was good to go, to listen to so many firsthand accounts and people so confused by the gliding walk, and they're like, it was like it's on a conveyor, and they always have a difficult, and then to get some of the data in your book to understand, that actually makes sense. You can't walk on stilts like we do. You have to have a little more like a vehicle suspension, to absorb shocks and things like that, and let alone the difference in feet between us and them. But can you talk a little bit about that gliding walk and why it's that way?
Right. Well, that's what I was making reference to when we were discussing the clearance of the swing limb, is this compliant gait, which means that in order to resist the jarring impact forces that a stiff-legged gait produces, and especially then with our arched foot, we tend to concentrate. We have a distinctive heel strike, and concentrate those pressures under a well-developed heel pad, and then that center of weight moves down along usually the outside of the foot and swings over medially to the ball under the base of the big toe, and which is the lead end of that arched foot, that platform. And so there's concentrated pressure there. Well, when as the body mass is increasing to the cube of linear dimensions, the surface of the foot is only increasing to the square of linear dimensions. So if you just scale up a human foot, especially one with limited contact because of an arched structure, you can't keep up with those pressures experienced by the foot structures. So anatomically, you can eliminate the arch and greatly widen the foot so that its overall surface area is increased. And then instead of a heel strike, you look at the wide variety of Sasquatch tracks, and they don't have that differential indentation of the heel and the forefoot. I mean, some have mistaken the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, which is a totally different mechanic, with that differential heel and forefoot. But instead, when they walk, they come down with a relatively flat foot in contact with the soil. When the heel starts to come up and weight is now concentrated under the entire forefoot, not just the ball, and that's where you get the deepest impression.
Right.
And then sometimes as a result of that excessive compression, you get the mid-tarsal pressure ridge or a disc, or if it's really muddy, extrusion of mud, creating that kind of speed bump looking mid-tarsal pressure ridge. And then very little toe off. So the push off comes from the entire forefoot. It never rolls all the way to the toes, because because we really reach out with that lead foot, we maintain contact till the very end,
right,
off with our big toe.
It makes sense.
Sasquatch uses the toes for grip to prevent backsliding, but the pressure mostly comes under the forefoot, and then only the toes are only incorporated into that partially or sometimes, and usually not. And so you'll even get imprints, and these produce some weird looking casts where the toes, the forefoot has pressed in, but the toes have kind of dorsiflexed. They haven't pushed into the soil. There isn't a need for traction. And so what you get is just this little bit of the toe. You get this little triangular shape, which is just the base of the toe. And it makes it look like these stubby little pointy toes sticking out the end of the cast. But I have examples where I have a footprint of that individual from a trackway where that has occurred, but then the next print, the toes have engaged, and you can see the full length. You put them side by side, and you can see how they match up in every aspect, except the abbreviation of the toes. I mean, so it's really, really amazing. So that's one way, and Krantz kind of goes through this argument in his book really well, where he tries to show how the Sasquatch can approximate human compressive forces per square unit of surface remarkably well by doing that. But then I think in addition, and I don't remember now if he talks about this, I'll have to go back. I always forget, I know if where I get certain ideas or where I've developed them, but then discover someone else has as well. The other way to address it is behaviorally, the way you walk. So you can do it anatomically, increase surface area, increase contact surface. But if you walk with this compliant gait, which is also sometimes colloquially referred to as the Groucho walk in human performance literature, because Groucho Marx, for those who don't know, Groucho Marx had this signature forward lean with his cigar and his spectacles.
Right. Yep.
And he would walk leaning forward with his knees bent, in a crouching kind of posture. So they called it a Groucho walk. But if you adopt this compliant gait, don't stride out like a goose stepping, SS officer and Gestapo, but rather you walk like you're a cat burglar, then it reduces the ground reaction forces, and it's very efficient with the massive weight because you store a lot of kinetic energy in the ligaments and tendons.
Wow.
Around the joints, the ankles and the knees and hips. But these studies in human performance have shown that a Groucho walk can reduce ground reaction forces, which is the reciprocal of what we think of as the impact forces. The biomechanists talk about the ground pushing back against the foot. So it's a ground reaction force by as much as 18%. 18%. Wow. So you combine the anatomical changes with that behavioral change, and their feet can accommodate that. Even if they do break into a sprint, like you might see a chimp or gorilla do, there's certainly a chimp or gorilla is not going to be running marathons. I don't think a Sasquatch would run a marathon, but they'd be capable of walking one, I think. In other words, walking over in distances with endurance. So covering 20 miles in a night for a Sasquatch might be just a normal survey of their territory or of resources in their territory, foraging. So, yeah.
Wow.
It's, and who'd have thunk, as we sit and pick these things apart,
I know,
and they bear up under scrutiny. I mean, there's rational explanations. You don't have Bigfoot with a third leg, and trying to accommodate, figure out how that can be rationalized. It's all the anatomies make sense, and they're elegantly interrelated in subtle ways.
Yeah,
good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me wonder about. And I know when I met you at Phenomenon in Vernal, you had a lot of castings there to look at, and I always wondered about that. Why are we seeing this entire foot rather than like the arch and the and the toes more prominent and that sort of thing. So your explanation just satisfied my question on
Yeah.
that. So I appreciate that very much.
Okay.
In the search for, you got all these people going out in the field, and we mentioned the guys, the team from Expedition Bigfoot and whatnot, applying different sciences. So I'm going to switch gears here just a little bit, and get your thoughts on this. One of the things that you had mentioned previously, right after we first got started, was vocalizations.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I have not seen anyone incorporate this into their field work, is infrasound.
Yeah.
That's one of the areas where, and I was very happy to hear you talk about this in the book. But infrasound, by some of the animals like tigers or something like that, is below the audible range, but yet could instill some fear or hesitancy in the prey that they're going after.
Right.
What do you feel about infrasound in relation to Sasquatch, or the idea of Sasquatch using this type of thing? Is that something that somebody could get use a detector to try
Sure.
to get that? What's your thoughts on that?
Sure. You just have to have a microphone that is sensitive enough to pick up frequencies in that low range,
Mhm.
and then have the means to evaluate it, by sonographically, so you can see the actual vocalization quantified on a sonogram. And there are, I believe, at least David Ellis at the Olympic Project, who has kind of taken the lead on the study of vocalizations. And anytime I get someone submitting what sounds like an interesting recording, I direct them his way. And as a result, he, and through his own efforts and others, has accumulated quite a library, not only of sounds recordings attributed possibly to Sasquatch, but in the process of studying these, he's developed a library of reference vocalizations of wildlife out there that could commonly be mistaken for possibly a Sasquatch.
Mhm.
Now, whether he's recording and analyzing for infrasound, I'm not certain, so I won't go out on that limb. We tried it. I got in touch with the Cornell Bioacoustics Laboratory, which is probably the premier institution here in the States.
Mhm.
They were the ones who, were heading up the ivory-billed woodpecker study, and they, their recorders were used in studies of elephants that showed elephants used infrasound, and so on and so on. And so they were quite intrigued at my proposal. I was very forthright with them and what I wanted to do, and they were very patient and made available, which weren't commercially available then, one of their autonomous recording units that you could set out there and turn on as long as it had sufficient battery power, and it would record. The problem was, first of all, I'm not very savvy when it comes to basic electronics and electronic components, that aren't customer friendly, off the shelf type of things, and it really requires someone who has that knack to wrangle and make their way through all the proper switch settings and so forth on these things, and be able to not manipulate, but manage the recorded data. But the bigger problem was, if you left your camera out there for 48 hours, your recorder for 48 hours, the only way to evaluate that recording was to sit there and bring it up on the screen with your earphones, if you wanted a context at least, even though you couldn't hear the infrasound, and listen in real time,
Right.
or watch in real
48
time.
hours.
And it just was not manageable. I mean, these people, graduate students who this was their going to be their livelihood, they might be able to do it or hire it out to other undergrads to do for them. But now it's gotten to where you can download those files. It will automatically parse them. You can download them individually. You can run them through a program, and you can bracket the frequency range that you're interested in so that it will stop at any occurrence of that. And so it's something that should be undertaken. It's just that I'm not the person at this point to do it. But what's interesting is, since the time I wrote my book, in which there was only data on of monkeys, not apes. No, apes weren't included. There was one particular researcher, one paper that I cited and quoted the author, who had demonstrated a direct correlation between the formant frequency and home range size. And he had demonstrated that in these various monkey species and across different communities, as the home range size increased, the formant frequency of their territorial calls decreased.
Wow.
And so would therefore carry farther through their home range, through the vegetation and such. I asked him, and reported this in the book, if you had to bet, if you were a gambling man and had to bet whether gorillas and chimps and orangs utilized infrasound in their loud calls, do you think they do? And he goes, oh yeah. He said, I would be quite confident to predict that they do. Since that time, there has been a published study. I don't think it was his, but there's been a published study now that has demonstrated gorillas do in fact produce infrasound. And and there was a very detailed CT scan study of orangutans showing, exploring the extent and anatomy of their extralaryngeal air sacs, which is really fascinating to visualize in that way. And because the orangs are, and it correlates with their solitary behavior and their very large home range. The males broadcast these raucous calls. These extralaryngeal air sacs are used in the resonance and the production and projection of this infrasonic, presumably infrasonic elements of the loud call. And so that seems to be borne out. There was actually, I came upon a YouTube video because the person actually cited this in the caption. The gorilla, it was in captivity, and the gorilla, you could see it visibly inflate its chest, one of its air sacs.
All right. The
chest, puffs out, not just puffs out, but it inflates like, and then all of a sudden he starts doing the chest thumping. So he had inflated the air sac as a resonating chamber upon which to pound in order to make a more resounding noise. And this is interesting because I've often argued that no one has seen a Sasquatch pick up a stick and rap a tree.
Yeah, exactly.
We attribute this tree knocking, and I've often said, well, how is it? I mean, you go out in the woods, especially a wet forest like in the Pacific Northwest, and try to pick up a stick from the ground. If you broke one off that was, up in there and used it, maybe, but nothing. I mean, just the odds. Maybe I'm limiting myself here, but I think that they're using body parts, even clapping. We've got observational data of gorillas using claps to get one another's attention or to ward off some other animal.
That's interesting that you say that, because I've listened to maybe 2,000 firsthand accounts. Never have they had one hitting a tree with a stick. And I think it's just natural. You hear a sound, you associate it with what you think it might be. But out of those 2,000 or so instances, I can think of two where they actually saw it hit a tree, and it hit it with their hand, and the hand was cupped, and they said they actually had difficulty describing, because they're like, what I saw didn't didn't correlate to what I heard. It sounded like it had something in its hand, like it had a rock or something.
Yeah.
And because it was a much louder rap or strike than I would have thought, a human could do, because that's all you can go off of. So that's interesting, because I know that everybody talks about wood knocks. It sounds like a wood knock, but we actually haven't seen one actually do that, or, so how do you know it's actually making that sound that way? It may still be a Sasquatch making the sound, which is great, but how they're doing it is of interest.
Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I know I generally try to wrap these up at about 2 hours, and we're already an hour and a half in. So, and without, and I have so many
I got plenty
questions, but
we can always do it again.
Yeah. Yes. And I would like to do that at some point. Absolutely. But what I'd like to do is throw this out to the chat. And I saw early on, there was a lot of different things going on in the questions, and I'd like to see, there we go with one now. Do Yowie and other creatures of like walk the same way?
Right.
That's it.
Well, the Yowie is for me, it's that, what is that knot that, in Greek mythology, I haven't been able to untie it, figure it out, because there are huge biogeographic challenges to the prospect of a relic hominoid, at least an ape-like one, like a Sasquatch, and some of their descriptions would seem to point to something like a Sasquatch, and yet there is no consistent footprint record or data set for the Yowie. I did a series of kids' learning books for each of the relic hominoids, and when I tackled the Yowie one, I tried to summarize that in one page, where I went through the various publications and articles and books and cut and paste their various footprints attributed to the Yowie. No two of them are the same. Except for those found by a particular person, and there's obvious hoaxes. The ones that are 5-digit, but they're very questionable, and some are obvious, transparently outright hoaxes. So without that fossil record, I'm the guy who keeps coming back to the footprints are the kind of the litmus test for me. And the absence of those footprints raises a lot of questions. Some have suggested, as I've only sort of done tongue in cheek, because evolution is so marvelous and at creating convergent forms, convergent species. And I've often used in my lectures, this textbook diagram that shows, you've got a wolf, a timber wolf, and a marsupial wolf, and you've got a cat, and there's a marsupial cat, and each of these guilds, or each of these niches, from carnivores, canid-like carnivores, felid-like carnivores, burrowers, gliders, etc. And here's the marsupial, which all emerged from something that would
Really
look
different.
akin to a North American possum, and yet have evolved to fill these various occupations, these various niches in the community, in remarkably convergent ways. So where's the primate, convergent? The large-bodied ape is there a marsupial, rare, elusive marsupial? I don't know. So we have no data. We have nothing about how Yowies walk, except anecdotal descriptions, perhaps by some eyewitnesses. But and then when you look at other relic hominoids, people sometimes think that Sasquatch is seen all over the globe. Well, it's true. There are Asian correlates,
Right,
which I think are the ancestral population that gave rise to Sasquatch once its range expanded into North America. But their footprints are Sasquatch-like. And I could take I went to the Caucasus in Russia with a host invited me over, and we replicated a pair of casts from a long line of tracks that were witnessed, and the track maker witnessed by many people in this village and the small town. And if I took them, my point is, if I took them and shuffled them in amongst those casts I had on display, they're very clear, full-size tracks that were left in snow and mud. You wouldn't be able to differentiate them as something different geographically.
That means a lot.
Yeah, and so I think that Sasquatch represents a species that has a circum-Pacific distribution that extends all the way across southern Asia and up through Mongolia and ends up over in the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. Then you've got something around those Mongolian mountains and even amongst the Caucasus as well that leaves a footprint that looks essentially like a stocky human with an arch, broad foot and splayed toes, and of a human size range that are attributed to the Almasti, perhaps a relic Neanderthal, or maybe a Denisovan now, for all we know.
Mm-hmm.
And then down in Southeast Asia, the Hobbit was discovered. Well, it turns out the researchers acknowledged kind of humbly, sheepishly, the locals have actually been telling us stories about these little hairy people that live up in the mountains and to this day.
Wow.
And so maybe the Hobbit represents a fossil remain of the Orang Pendek, the Ibu Gogo, the Ndutu. There's a name, with each ethnic group and each geographic region. But that's a relic Australopithecine in my book. So again, we talked about this bushy tree. There are branches on this bushy tree, whether it's a giant Paranthropus or get on the other side of the fence, and we're in with the hominoids, the apes, and a Gigantopithecus extant. We've got relic Australopithecines. We've got relic Neanderthals. We've got the Yeti, which has a foot that has a divergent, if these are credible footprints, the only ones that are credible in my book, because there's just all the rest are either bare or just unintelligible, so we don't know what they are.
Right.
Has a divergent big toe, thumb-like big toe, just like a tree-dwelling ape. And that's probably where they live, in the trees, in the forests, in the valleys, between the snowy passes where their footprints are seen by the mountaineers trekking up towards the peaks, above the tree line. And so, so each one is a little different, walks different, locomotes different. I think, Yetis probably only walk bipedally because the snow's cold on their hands. I've got footprints. I mean, it sounds silly, but I've got footprints of gorillas. I made arrangements with the Hogle Zoo down in Salt Lake that at the first snowfall, they were to call me, and I would drive down. And then what they did is they waited to feed the animals until I got there. They scattered their at least their appetizers out amongst the outdoor enclosure, and they went out and walked through the snow. I wanted to get some gorilla footprints in the snow for a comparative basis. And these guys didn't like to put their hands down. I mean, they generally walk quadrupedally, but they'd hold their hands up, clutched them. The snow's cold, but they will walk. Every once in a while, they would put their knuckles down. So I've got some good, cool knuckle prints of gorillas as well. So I think that the Yeti, when it's walking up over that snowy pass, even though it has a foot that looks like a gorilla or chip, it just walks bipedally to keep its hands up out of the snow till it gets on the other side.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Here's another question from Any Xantics. What is your personal conclusion of what Sasquatch is based on the DNA Genome Project?
Well, there's no conclusion to be drawn from the Sasquatch Genome Project. It's a complete farce, and its results are completely unreliable. So set that on the shelf, and we could talk about that another time. So there is no DNA for Sasquatch. But the challenge has been, it's been kind of twofold. One, the efforts to get DNA have concentrated primarily on hair. One of what I think are, and I'm still comfortable standing by this conclusion, are one characteristic amongst those that distinguish Sasquatch hair from the other forest creatures out there is a lack of a cellular medulla.
Yep.
It also differentiates it from the majority of humans as well. Very rarely does a human someone with a tow-headed, light, fine blonde hair may have a hair strand that is lacks a cellular medulla, but they also are fairly fine. We're talking about a hair that is rather consistently about 65 microns across. So an average human coarseness with a parallel side, non-taper, no evidence of any underfur. So it's not fur with differentiated guard hairs and underfur, it's hair. And the only other thing it could be is human. And so, but with that acellular medulla, there's very little cellular material, nuclei and mitochondria, and you're just left with a core, or a shaft rather, that's made up of keratin and a cuticle, which is also keratin. But so no DNA to speak of, but at least precious little. Makes it very difficult to extract DNA. On those occasions when DNA, rare occasions when DNA has been extracted from a hair, or let's just say gotten off a hair sample, it invariably is identified as human. But what are they looking at? They're looking usually at a single or a partial part of a single mitochondrial gene. And if this creature is a hominin, if it's more human-like, and when I say that, I want to say with caution. By that I mean it's just on this side of the split, not that it's a Neanderthal or a Homo erectus or a wild human population of some kind. If it's on this side, so it's something like derived a giant form of Paranthropus or an Australopithecine, or it's on just the other side, it's a Gigantopithecus. But if it's something like a Paranthropus, then its genome will be more closely related to ours than a Gigantopithecus, which has been shown, at least based on amino acid sequence, to be most closely related to the orangutan. They don't really say how close, but it's in that cluster. So great apes can be kind of divided into the African apes, derived from Dryopithecines, and the Asian apes, derived from the Shivapithecines. But they were big. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of species in each of these radiations, of which we have orangutans over here and chimps and gorillas over here, the only representatives of these quite numerous and diverse radiations during the Miocene and even into the Pliocene and Pleistocene. Gigantopithecus made it to mid-Pleistocene. So my point is, saying that Gigantopithecus is more closely related to orangutan is a very generic statement, a very vague, ambiguous statement. Anyway, we may be talking about a species that is shares a genetic identity to the degree of 99.9%, a tenth of a percent, a half a percent. Chimps are similar to us up to 94, 97%, depending on where you're looking,
Yep.
Just a few percentage points different. It's only those few percentage points that makes us human. Because the rest of us, 97% of us, is chimpanzee. I mean, we share with chimpanzees. So my point is, if you're just looking, if you've only got, maybe one or a half of a nucleotide, or let's say one nucleotide difference for every 100 or 200, and these aren't evenly spread out throughout the genome, they're clustered. And if you don't find a cluster, then what you're looking at is going to look like what? A human. It's going to be identical to human.
Yeah.
So that's where these conclusions, in my opinion, it comes back. And well, they say either the usual response is either they're contaminated through handling by the witnesses,
Right,
or it's simply a misidentified human hair, which could happen.
Yeah.
Because hair persists. And anyway, the third option that usually isn't discussed is you just haven't sequenced enough to be able to differentiate it from a human. So your result is always going to be human.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's unfortunately where we're at. We just it's going to take, and I hope there's a project underway. Dr. Darby Orcutt at University of North Carolina, who is not a molecular biologist himself, but he specializes in development and collaborative project management. And so he's getting people together, and to his credit and to my delight, he's recruited a couple of active research laboratories with molecular geneticists who are willing to undertake analysis of putative Sasquatch tissue samples, including primarily hair, but whatever else might be worthy of taking a look at.
Yeah.
And they understand this argument that I'm making, that you're going to have to compare, or I mean, you're not just going to be able to do this little cursory preliminary test, because we're not trying to differentiate, a cat from a horse. We're trying to differentiate two very closely related primates.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they're going to have to do not only mitochondria, but nuclear genes. It's going to be timely and expensive, time consuming, not timely, but time consuming and expensive. But if they're making that commitment, so that's our best hope right now. Otherwise, we're on, don't put your eggs in Dr. Melba Ketchum's basket, because they'll be rotten before you take them back out.
There's been a lot of talk about the lack of bones, and you in the book, when I was listening, you were talking about the fact, and you had brought up the question, how many people have actually seen a bear skull in the woods, right. And I, for one, have not, and I spent a lot of time going out into the forest and doing things like that, and hiking. I've never seen a bear. So the question from Kat there was asking about, what do you think is for the lack of that, the bones or anything like that? Do they bury their dead, or
right.
do they take them off? Or do they migrate somewhere else to end their life?
Right. Well, I don't think they bury their dead, because one, I don't think they're sophisticated. Intellectually, they're not intelligent enough for that kind of behavior. That's a human behavior, and I contest the assertion that the Lottie buries its dead. There is overwhelming evidence that it's so unlikely a scenario that the washing of remains into those deep dark crevices is much more likely, and in spite of the allegations of fire presence and scratches on the walls, artwork, quote unquote artwork. Anyway, again, there's a lot of subtle. I'll not say that. Never mind. I don't think they're burying their dead. And also it doesn't fit with their presumed social pattern. Right. All the footprint finds. Most of the sightings are of solitary individuals. They're solitary, and a solitary animal, unless it advertises or broadcasts its pending fate, gets old and decrepit. But usually, that's not the case. You become incapacitated, especially animals that have no sense of death or an afterlife. I want to be careful saying that too, because animals certainly recognize. I think they're more sensitive to things than we in the past, as animal behaviorists have given them credit. But the point is, most animals secrete themselves off, as you point out, into an out-of-the-way spot, and they die. And then they're rendered very rapidly by the natural elements, both biologic and physical. I used to show my students, when we would talk about taphonomy, what are the principles that govern the fate of corpses once they die? And there was a poached elephant that tusks had been taken, but to take advantage of the opportunity for learning something about taphonomy, they set up a camera and a time-lapse film of the elephant's carcass, this full adult elephant. And in 2 weeks, as I recall, if I get the details right, it was fascinating to watch, all the things that happened, all the visitors and the action of the insects and this thing bloating and imploding. And in 2 weeks, there wasn't even a grease spot in the dirt. Everything was gone.
Wow.
Every bone was gone.
Wow.
This elephant, And so, that's not to say that we don't find elephant bones every once in a while. But for a long time, it was a mystery. Where did they go? There must be an elephant graveyard with all this treasure of ivory, right? Which was what the attraction was, more than the answering the mystery. But
right, yeah, exactly.
But there were no elephant graveyards. It's just that the savannah does a fantastic job of recycling its raw materials, and the same goes with Bigfoot. So I think the other factor to bear in mind too is which the common denominator for a lot of these questions is the rarity, the numbers. There are far fewer of these than a lot of people think, and from my experience and interaction, even some experienced investigators, people are starting to kind of catch on. I have a presentation where I address this and give a rationale and try to show, even Dr. Krantz tried to emphasize the rarity. And in his book, I think the ratio he gives is 200 or 1. It's either 100 or 200, somewhere between to 1 or 200 black bear for every 1 Sasquatch.
Wow.
And what's interesting is I'll give a regional talk tailored to that state, and I'll walk them through. Let's go at it from the ground up, so to speak. We start with the landforms and the forest cover and the this and the that. And then there was a paper that was published that showed a remarkable or correlation between the distribution of black bear and the bioclimatic factors that determine that distribution and the areas where credible Bigfoot sightings come. Remarkable overlap, so much so that they sort of tongue-in-cheek said, well, there's the explanation for Sasquatch encounters. They're just misidentified bear. Well, they actually weren't convinced of that, but for the sake of getting their paper published, they took that kind of tongue-in-cheek position. But the point is, it's a great jumping off point. You look then at the state. Are there black bear? Does the habitat support black bear? And then where are they distributed? And how dense is the population? How many black bear are there? So like you look at my state of Idaho, and you can kind of outline the forests. And the other correlation with Sasquatch reports was precipitation. John Green drew attention to that 30 years ago in his book. And so if you look at the precipitation, you look at the black bear population, you look at the forest, the development, where the human population is, et cetera, and then using a model of social structure based on an orangutan with a surface area, a distribution of range of 1,000 square miles. We won't go into all that, but how many of those can you fit? Anyway, go through this exercise. Each of those ranges is a male who overlaps a couple of female, maybe with a couple of offspring. So in the state of Idaho, you can fit about 15. Let's say each of those 15 has 5 Sasquatch in it. There's 75 Sasquatch. In the entire state of Idaho, there's 35,000 black bear.
Yeah.
In Idaho. Well, if you take the 200 to 1 ratio, that's 1,750 Sasquatch. So our 1,750? No, it's not. 175. See, math. It's too late at night. Anyway, it comes up with a number that's remarkably convergent.
Right.
But it's just a couple of hundred.
Yeah.
And even if I'm off, if I'm off by 2 or 3 times, we're still talking about a number that is so small.
Right.
So in all the state of Idaho, with more wilderness than any of the other lower 48, of those, say, 75 Sasquatch, how many of them are in their golden years?
Right.
How many of them are so how often does a Bigfoot die?
Yeah.
Once every 10 years in the entire state of Idaho? and we're wondering why we don't find the bones.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you would think, bones accumulate. Well, they don't. If they're not dissolved by the elements, they're chewed up by the squirrels and porcupines, and even deer will chew up to get the calcium.
Yep.
And so they just don't accumulate. It's just like any other, you use the example of the bear, but given the numbers that I cited, we'd be better off saying, how many of you have ever found the skull of a wolverine or a marten or a fisher? Some of the people are going to ask you, what's a marten? What's a fish? Not alone ever having seen a skull of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Definitely, leaves it to wonder about that for sure. Because that was always my area too, to say, well, where's the bones? Where's the body? Where's the actual physical evidence to say that Sasquatch exists? And it sounds to me, and I'm just saying, I'm going to wrap this up, but it sounds to me like you, based upon the evidence, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I get the feeling that you feel that this creature does exist.
Sure.
Just what is it? We don't know yet. And
yeah, I always deflect the label of believer. It's not a question of belief, and I don't mean to wax into a sermonette here, but it's there's a couple of aspects of that. The ideological skeptics, the hobbyist skeptics, use the moniker true believer as a derogatory label.
Yeah.
And when you use the word belief, it usually connotes, in most people's mind, an acceptance of something in the absence of evidence. So it's a conviction without evidence, whereas I'm convinced by the evidence. And so, do I know? No, I don't know. I mean, I have to be honest with myself. I've seen things, I've heard things, I've found tracks. I've studied so much that there's no way I could just walk away and say, it's all just malarkey.
Exactly.
But I don't have that irrefutable affirming experience to say I know. And some people lay claim to that, and I defer to that experience and that position. And I'm not out to compel people to even to my level of conviction. If anything, I'm, as an educator, I'm trying to present the data so that people will consider the question from an informed, educated position rather than an ignorant one, and see the wonder of it. I mean, rather than mocking people for or being open-minded to the possibility. Man, what an intriguing. There was an article in New Scientist magazine, which is the British equivalent of, say, our Discoverer or Scientific American. And this feature issue was devoted to what were deemed by the editorial board as the top 10 questions facing researchers in human evolution today. And number 9 on the list was, are other hominins alive today? For the first time, a quote, legitimate, if you will, a mainstream, an orthodox journal, publication, or magazine was giving legitimacy to the very real possibility of relic hominoids. This is why I use that term now, even over in preference to Sasquatch or Bigfoot or Omas or whatever. I can talk to my colleagues about the possibility of relic hominoids, but you say Sasquatch. And
exactly.
All the defenses come up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this has been fascinating, and I knew that it would be, and so did Mike. I mean, we barely touched on so many questions that we have, and I know that the chat had quite a few as well. And Kat said, please come back, Dr. Jeff. Fascinating, and we have so many questions for you. So I hope we can continue this down the road when you have some time. to cover some more. But this has been an absolutely wonderful and very educating evening, and I so appreciate your coming on. Mike, what do you think?
Fantastic. Love all the data. Love
Yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here, folks. And again, as I just said, we're going to talk to Dr. Meldrum about coming back and joining us once again. And we'll see if we can get some more of the questions that you have. Maybe we'll put out something and ask for the questions up ahead of time so that we can get a list of the ones that you may have that we didn't cover today. But again, Mike, thank you so much. And Dr. Meldrum, thank you so very much.
Yeah.
It's an honor to have you on the show. And I hope we can get to do this again very soon. Thank you, folks, for being here with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And keep posted, do that, subscribe, click on that subscribe button, and also click on that notification bell so you know when we are ready for part 2 with Dr. Meldrum. So I'm going to say goodnight to everybody. We'll catch you next time right here on the J Free 906 podcast.